Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to make puffy paw pads for your plushies just like this. So you can see from the side here that it's actually 3D. It sticks out from the hand itself and it looks really nice and gives it some dimension and some interest. And so I will show you how to do this. So I use applique to get this effect, and I most of the time use my embroidery machine to do my applique. You could do this by hand by yourself, and when I say by hand I don't mean actually stitching it out by hand, but I mean with your sewing machine. So you could just do this with a satin stitch yourself, but it probably would be a little bit more difficult. The secret with getting the puffy look, besides doing applique, is to actually add a layer of quilt batting underneath the fabric that you applique onto your piece. So you can see how thick this quilt batting is. It's about 1/2 inch. You could use a thinner quilt batting and just layer it up, but I specifically bought this one because it's nice and thick, so I don't have to cut multiple layers. And so when you add your fabric on top of the quilt batting, you get this really nice thick layer that you're going to applique onto your fabric. And so when you tack all that down, then the fabric sticks up at the side and gives it that nice puffy effect. So the first thing you need to do is design your applique file. So when I did this, I considered a few things. One is that you want your toe beans to be a decent size, because if they are too small, then you're not going to be able to get this effect. So these beans are nice and large. And so when you satin stitch it, you want to pay attention to the width of your satin stitch. So it needs to be wide enough so that it can capture your fabric when you do the applique, but at the same time, when you make it wide, it's going to start diminishing this puffy effect. So that's one reason why in the middle here, this satin stitch here is thinner where it meets rather than on the edge here. So this overall width where the two toe beans meet is about equal to the width of the outside here. And also, the larger that your object is, the puffier you can get it. So you can see how from the side, my larger toe bean, the middle part is puffier than the individual toe beans. And that's really just a surface area issue. So if you were to separate these toe beans out and make them smaller, they're going to be less puffy than if you combine them together and make them larger. But you would design this applique file in your embroidery program, or if you were doing it by hand, you can go ahead and draw it out yourself so that you can prepare to do the stitching. So the first thing you have to do is to prepare your fabric for applique. So I have hooped my Minky here, and if you need some advice on how to hoop Minky, you can check out another one of my videos. But I have my fabric hooped. You could float it if you want to. I hooped it just because my piece that I cut is a little bit larger than my hoop, but you can certainly float it if your piece is small enough, or if you like to float your fabric in general. So from here, I'm going to stitch the outline of the hand that I'm doing, and also stitch the basting stitches of the paw pad itself. And at this point, you also don't want to add any water-soluble stabilizer on top because you're doing applique, and you need to first tack down the fabric, and then you will add the water-soluble stabilizer after. So I've stitched out the outline of my hand, and this is optional, but when my pattern piece fits inside of my hoop, I like to go ahead and stitch the outline of the pattern piece just so I can cut it from here and I don't have to do any other sort of measurement and tracing. I can just directly cut it out. And I've also stitch the basting stitch of the applique for the paw pad. So this just helps me align where to lay my fabric. So now I have my quilt batting and the minky that's going to go on top, and I'm going to lay it onto this area and make sure that my minky is running the appropriate way. So since this is a hand, it's going to be pointing downwards, so the pile actually runs from this end to this end, so it runs up. So you just lay it on top and then bring that over to your embroidery machine, or you can go ahead and start stitching the applique yourself on your machine. But because this is so thick, this is probably going to be pretty difficult to do by hand. I have not attempted it myself, but you'll see when I stick it under my embroidery machine how unwieldy it gets because this is so thick. So if you wanted to do it by hand, maybe cut down on the thickness of your quilt batting, but then you're going to get not as puffy as a paw pad as you would otherwise. So I have my piece hooped in here, and you can see how nice and puffy it is. It's lying just underneath my foot here, and my foot isn't even put down yet, but it's already touching the foot even in the raised position. So I have my machine ready to go to do the actual stitch that is going to tack down this fabric onto the base. And so I'm going to very carefully hold the outside of the fabric so that it stays nice and flat and even, because it's going to get very unwieldy soon because it's so thick, and trying to stitch through such a thick fabric, I just want to help guide it, but be very careful because this is a little bit dangerous, but just be mindful and pay attention as you do it. Okay, so it's all tacked down now, and so what I have to do from here is trim off all the extra fabric around the paw pad. So now I have to trim all the extra fabric around this paw pad. And so you don't want to unhoop it yet because you're not done. You still have to do the satin stitch. But first you're going to do a pass with a larger pair of scissors. I find this a little easier to take off a big part of the fabric before you go in and get more close to the stitches with a pair of embroidery scissors. And your goal is to get as close to the stitches as possible without cutting the stitches, because the closer you get to the stitches, the cleaner your piece is going to come out, because your satin stitch is going to capture the edges of your fabric, and if you don't cut close enough to the fabric, then you're going to have little bits of fabric sticking out beyond the satin stitch. And you can clean it up a little bit after you satin stitch your piece, but you won't be able to get as close to the stitch after you do the satin stitching as you would before you do that stitch. So now that I've cut off my bulk of the fabric, I'm going to come in with a pair of curved embroidery scissors like this and clean up the edges. So I got these on Amazon. They're really nice and sharp and good. You want a nice sharp pair of scissors for this because you want to get as close as you can to the stitches. So just hold with one hand and you kind of want to push against the fabric with your scissors to get close. And it can get a little bit tight in these areas because there's not a whole lot of room between the different paw pads, but do the best you can. So I'm just pushing against the fabric and then cutting, but again, don't go too aggressively because you don't want to cut that stitch that you did, because then the fabric will come loose and then your satin stitch won't capture the edge and it'll start to fall apart. And the edges, the little edges of the inward curves can be particularly difficult to clean up, but you just use the tip of your scissors. You should be able to snip out any fabric. And make sure that you're getting both the minky and the quilt batting as you're cleaning up the edges. And make sure that you don't cut the fabric beneath it either. Alright, so I think it's pretty well trimmed up now. I'm gonna run a lint roller over it. So I think it looks good. Not really seeing any areas that stand out like they're not trimmed enough. And if any of them aren't, then I can just clean it up after the satin stitch. But you can also run your finger along the edges, and if any of them are a little too long, you'll be able to tell that way. So I'm going to cut out a piece of water-soluble stabilizer just to put over the top of this hoop, and then I'm going to put it back in my embroidery machine to run the satin stitch. So I have my water-soluble stabilizer on top, and now all I have to do is finish this off with the satin stitch from my embroidery file. Alright, so my applique is all done. Now I just have to take it out of the hoop and remove the stabilizer. And the one between can be a little bit difficult to get out. You can always run some water over it if you can't get all the little bits. So now I'm just gonna trim off my jumps. Okay, so now we can really see how our applique did. See, I need to do some trimming around the satin stitch. Didn't all get picked up, so I just need to clean up some of these edges with my curved embroidery scissors, but it should be an easy trim. Just like I said, it gets really tough to get in close to these edges here with how small this tends to be, and the gap is pretty small there. But I think this looks really good overall, so now I can just cut out around my pattern piece as well once I'm done, and can sew this up and get it onto my plush. So hope you guys learned something today, and if you use this technique, I'd love to see what you make with it. And thanks for watching. Bye-bye.